Well, welcome back to a new episode of the Threshold Lab. And today's guest is going to bring something that I have not had a chance to provide in previous guests that we've had on the show because this particular gentleman is also a host of a podcast. He's been doing it far longer than I have, and if you haven't tuned into it, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it's a phenomenal podcast for coaches, but we have Coach Billy Allen joining us here this afternoon, and I'm really more than anything just excited to peel back some layers because I've gotten to know Billy a little bit over the last year, and we've had a chance to have some conversations through his podcast and explore some of these topics pertaining to leadership and coaching the mental game, and anything in between. But I'm excited to kind of turn the mic around and have Billy share a little bit about his experiences, and there's some things and some life experiences, some professional experiences, and just some cool projects that he has pursued already in his lifetime that I think create this like really cool blend of perspective that I want to tap into today. So, with all that kind of being said, Billy, I appreciate you taking some time to share with the audience and be here.
Happy to be here. It's been a pleasure having you on my podcast. I've learned so much about a topic that I'm really passionate about. I feel like those episodes are like my favorites on mental performance with you guys. I'm happy to be here and hopefully I can be of some use to your audience.
I have no doubt in that. And, I think when you have a guest that has kind of the mix and blend of different experiences, there's obviously a lot of different places like we could start with, and we'll kind of see where the conversation organically goes. But one thing that you also bring into this conversation that is completely new, at least for me and previous guests that I brought in, is like you're also an author. You've written a book called The Inner Night, Train and Compete Like a Champion. And I would love to maybe kind of start there and hear not just the conceptualization of the book and what it's about, but also like really what the inspiration was for that for you at whatever given time in your life you wrote it.
Yeah, so I've had like two big passions my whole life, and it's been volleyball and writing storytelling. As a kid, it was more comic books and then some movie stuff, and then it's been books the last 10 years or so. So I actually have, as of this week, I have uh, 5 books out now. The Inner Night specifically is a cool blend of. It's hard to explain because it's a fiction story, but it has lessons for athletes and coaches. So it's kind of a parable about training and competing and a lot of the mental game, which obviously is hopefully dear to your listeners. The inspiration was John Mayer, my other co-host, and I. We had done a Coach Your Brains Out book based on our podcasts, more centered on coaching and practice design and that kind of stuff. And one of our guests we had on was Joshua Medcalf, who wrote Chop Wood, Carry Water. And we really like that idea of like a fun story with lessons kind of woven in. And so he kind of challenged me to do it. And I think the initial idea was Bernie Holiday, when we had him on, talked about the training and trusting mindsets and just kind of like the different mental side of that. So the book was kind of started to be about that and to tell a cool story. And then it kind of, you know, we kind of explored a bunch of different avenues. So if I have to pitch it, it's a fun story for athletes. It's really short and easy and hopefully entertaining and gives you some medicine mixed in with the fun story.
Hopefully you forgive me. Didn't mean to mention as like, oh, this is the only book that you've written
No,
because I know you have those other books, the handful of books that you've now produced. And this one, obviously, it if correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost a blend of some of the other ones. You have the Coach Your Brains Out, very coaching oriented, and obviously the art and science behind coaching volleyball. But then you have these other books like Royal Blood, and I believe it's like Requiem. Was about to butcher that. Requiem for a House Octavian, correct?
yeah, yeah. So that's like a total nothing to do with volleyball. It's just a fiction fantasy series. I mean, there's some stuff in there that is, taken from my lens on how learning works. And then the Coach Your Brains, that was more of a straight coaching book. So yeah, this is a blend of like a fantasy, not fantasy, it's a jousting tournament where a knight is competing, but it's kind of a mix of lessons too. So yeah, it's kind of like a little hybrid of both of those two books.
So I think with that, what I'm so curious about is like I have dabbled a little bit in writing, not in a book form, but in other mediums. And I think it's a really interesting process to engage in because it is such a unique way to get thoughts out of your head onto paper and to start to think about how you conceptualize lessons and things like that. So as you were crafting maybe this particular book, how did you see the process of writing it also connect to your own experiences, whether that be as a coach or even from your playing and competitive background?
Yeah, I think twofold. I think on like a macro level, process of writing and playing are like they're like there's a lot of similarities. The idea of like you're out there practicing all the time for a competition that's like in the future and just putting in the work every day. And writing is very much the same way. A novel can sound daunting because it's so long, but you get half hour every morning and you chip away and you stay consistent and disciplined. You hit walls where you're not growing or learning and you have to backtrack. It's a maze in itself, but over time it adds up. So I think as far as that, like the disciplines, there's a lot of similarities. Having to be adaptable, having to be all that kind of stuff. As far as the story specifically, it's told through the point of view of this character who's an aspiring knight. And for me, the lessons I've taken from my own playing is just how messy it is on the mental game, and how I think when I thought of like elite players, I always picture them as kind of mentally bulletproof, where they kind of had their game down and they were just super confident all the time. And by the time I reached that level, I wouldn't have any more nerves or doubts or worries. And that just hasn't been my experience or the experience of the elite players I've talked to. So like it was a cool activity to kind of write from the character's point of view, and just all the stuff and messy stuff I had when I approached competition before games, during games, all the distractions. So definitely a lot from my own experience was put into that story.
I think that could be a good place to go to before we get into the direct coaching background, is to explore kind of your playing and competitive experience. And I think with that as well, what I'm actually interested in talking about first is just like you've got this interest that you've developed now and this love of understanding the mind and how it works and how it helps us all enable kind of this best version of ourselves. But what was a moment like at what point in your competitive career did that start to get on your radar and become something that you became more of a direct student of?
Yeah, I mean, I think throughout you're trying to, I was reading books, trying to get better at it. But I think what really like, and it sounds really late because it's, only recently. But during the pandemic, I was working with, when I went on the national team, I was working with a sports psychologist named Peter Haberl, who would lead some sessions with me, my coach and I, and then some basic level of mindfulness and stuff. But during the pandemic, we had a lot of downtime, and he offered up for kind of all USA athletes, just kind of like weekly sessions. And I like dove in. I was like, I'm not able to play right now. The beaches around me were closed. I have my little garage workouts I could do, but like, what can I do to get better? And this seemed like, one of the only ways. And I just really dove into this. And I think I've struggled on my own as far as like the value of meditation. But I just kind of said, hey, this is like the one thing I can do right now to be improving. And so in 2020, just being consistent with him and doing all these like social noting and mindfulness practices, I really saw not just how it could help me, be calmer under pressure and that kind of stuff, but just like, I don't know, I saw a clear translation to volleyball and also the rest of my life, more patience and stuff like that and awareness. So that was probably like a spark where I really like took from incremental, like the stuff you hear as an athlete, to like diving into this stuff and trying to get better.
Using that as maybe a catalyst point for you, what did you start to notice be different for you as a competitor and or like either on the in volleyball or outside of it?
I think it just allowed me to really like just detach from the feelings, and whatever thoughts and feelings I had were natural and normal, and they're coming, and it was just part of the process, and they didn't have power over me. And so I think instead of wrestling with trying to be confident or trying to think the right things, it was just coming back to my values, and like I can think and feel whatever, but I'm going to choose to act like this. I'm going to choose to compete hard. I'm going to choose to be this kind of player. And I think just that separation and just really having those core values, I think, set me up for success.
There's certainly multiple iterations of this, but you hear people talk about like there's like the event plus your response equals the
Mm.
outcome, and like you can kind of tie back to like Viktor Frankl in his book Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks a little bit about just like choosing your response and the difference, but in creating space in that. And it sounds like in a lot of ways that this was one way for you to practice creating that space. And then also then with whatever that final outcome was or result was, it's like, okay, how do I detach from it so it doesn't become all consuming of who I am, which is not an easy thing to do either.
Yeah, I like how you said the practice, because I feel like I would get these things conceptually. Like, okay, yeah, yeah, I get it. This is what you do. But for it to show up when it matters and to be consistent with it, it is a practice and something I had to invest time in.
What about in this current moment for you? So in terms of like, you start to learn, you kind of do a deeper dive, you start to create this practice and this discipline around it. But now here we are, 4 or 5 years later. And so how, if at all, does it still continue to show up and be a practice for you, or how has it evolved?
Yeah, I would say I'm way less consistent now, but it's something that we do with our team here at Stanford. We'll have our mindful minute before every practice, and I think when players come in my office or want to talk before games, sometimes it's about passing and setting and hitting, but a lot of times it's about just their own mindset. And so I think it's on the forefront of their minds a lot. And so, you know, we deal with it a lot. And then I think just in my own life, like, I have a flash of anger because my son did something, and I just can have that moment of separation, like you're talking about, where it'd be like, oh, like there is impatience here. And then once you identify it, then you can kind of, you said, choose how you act and respond.
I think that's awesome. I think I'm debating on whether or not I kind of stay. I kind of want to stay just for a couple more moments with your kind of playing background as a competitor and stuff. And now as you continue with it, but also like with some of these things that you've learned and everything, like now, like what have you found to be those kind of cardinal tools and skills that you think um, have become maybe separators for you and or those that you've also coached or been around, like you've been around a lot of other elite competitors as well, like what are some of those separators that you see from a mindset standpoint um, for them?
Yeah, I could, if you want to get like kind of practical, I can talk about like a practice I've been doing lately. The end of my career, the little routine I have is, so I play beach volleyball. So your feet are in the sand, and whenever I find myself distracted or nervous or doubting, or maybe I just got blocked, something didn't go my way, just my little reset that I use to kind of detach is I curl my toes in the sand. It's just a way to be like really present. Like I'm going to keep my head where my feet are, and then I just have this little like just bring it on kind of internal cue. And to me, that means like whatever the challenge is, like I just got blocked, I got ace, whatever it is, like bring it on. I want the next one to come, and I just choose to compete. And I don't always remember to do it, but so it is a practice that I kind of go back to. But I've also like carried it outside of volleyball too. Like I have to give a presentation. I'm nervous about public speaking. I'll, curl my toes in my shoes and say, bring it on. And that's just, again, going back to my values of, embrace the challenge and compete.
Mm, I
What
find
about you? Are
myself,
you, I'm curious, or do you have any kind of practice that you are currently doing?
well, I'm curling my toes right now, just
Yeah, there
hearing
you
you
go.
just as you were describing it, I found myself doing that. Um, so for me, I don't have so one thing that's been awesome over the last 7 years as I've kind of served in the role with the Arizona Diamondbacks is we've done so many meditation and guided sessions, and those have always been just these wonderful. I almost view them like pit stops in your day to just slow down, to get organized, to create a sense of clarity. You know, it's like, hey, if you want to perform with clarity, like, well, how does your routine create space for clarity? And I think that for me was a way to do that. I'm discovering now as I kind of step outside of my role and go into more my own thing. I'm learning how to do this a little bit more. I'm learning how to be more intentional in how I design my day, and particularly around transitions. So what you're in essence describing is kind of both an in the moment, pre-performance, whatever that is, whether it's volleyball, giving a presentation, and so on. The other tie that I bring up a lot is like, what are your transition routines? So, for example, what is my transition routine from the moment that I park my car in our, front driveway to go walk inside and to greet my family? Like it's like, okay, what is it that I can do to then show up and be fully present for them. So I actually do take a few breaths before I walk in. I'm also usually pretty deliberate that after I walk in and there's usually some sort of embrace and greet everybody. Like usually I want to try to go change my clothes. That's kind of like a physical, I guess, reset for me. So that for me is one. When it comes to like giving presentations and stuff, like I can promise you that anybody that has ever seen me give a presentation, it is a presentation that I've already done several mock sessions of in my head. I've walked around the block talking to myself. I've practiced in a quiet room trying to rehearse where I think I'm going to go and how I want it to feel and the cadence and those types of things. So like I am very much that type of person. I'm very much the type of person that believes that like it's easier to be adaptable in the moment if you're more prepared on the front end. And so anyway, I think for me, those are some ways that I've not only some practices, but also why I've tried to instill those. And again, doesn't mean that it's always in a formally systematic way, but those are the ones that I probably go to the most.
Really cool.
I think what's interesting too is anytime that you have somebody that has such a rich competitive playing background, there can be this, for some, more challenging transition into the realm of coaching, but then sometimes that's often influenced by the coaches that you've had and the mentors and the people you've seen, either in what you've liked and or sometimes like, okay, I don't want to do this. Like this is not authentic to me and it can work for somebody else, but not me. But before we get to that, what I'd actually love to kind of ask is like, when you were competing and when you've competed at this highest level, are there any things that you wish coaches maybe understood about either you or athletes in general that you now try to infuse or take into account in how you coach?
Yeah, I think one of the big turning points for me as a coach has been diving down. I don't know how much rabbit hole you want to get, but diving down this like ecological dynamics approach. Um, and in a nutshell, I think a lot of coaches and me as a coach and me as a player, we're so fixated on like this one ideal right way to move as far as technique. And I think as coaches, you kind of want compliance, where you want everybody in your club and your gym to be like on board doing how you think the best passers move or whatever it is. And it's different at every gym, so that kind of tells you maybe they're not all right. And I think one thing that I've learned through this is just that variability of movement isn't a mistake or an error. It's a function and it's a strength. So because everybody's an individual, the way I move is gonna be different than the way Zach moves. based on your action capacity, your height, all that stuff. And also the situation and context is always changing. And so instead of micromanaging movement of this like one ideal technique, which, we usually train in a very like sterile lab, easy ball situation, and doesn't maybe hold up in the game. So instead of that, just embracing the variability as a strength, and that if you like the skills emerge from that interaction in that environment. So if you can find a different way to pass, like, and it works, like awesome. I would much rather, an athlete be able to do multiple things rather than only be able to do one thing. And so I think just sorry, getting over a cold. And so just
Okay.
embracing that, like skills emerge and athletes' freedom to solve problems and not just try to follow some sort of scripted pattern. It's something that I would have benefited a lot more from a player, and I think as a coach, I would love to see that more. Versus, as a coach, it's really easy to like fixate on how somebody holds their hands or whatever, because we can kind of control that, we think. But players aren't. It's not just like a robot you plug a code into. It's a really active environment, and so I think just being open to how they're solving problems and just kind of guide them and collaborate rather than just kind of like dictate.
Kind of building off of that for just a moment, and whether this is through your own experiences, coaches you've been around, conversations you've had with so many different volleyball or just professional coaches in other sports, even, what do you feel like might be the common mistakes or challenge, like things that coaches do, even in it with, again, good intention, but inadvertently maybe to not set up the most ideal training environment for their players?
Yeah, I think one thing when you're really prescriptive of it as a coach and you're saying like giving a lot of answers to players, it's because you want to be helpful. Like they're struggling with the skill, you want to come swoop in and give them the right answer, and everybody's happy and you feel like you're learning. But I think athletes learn best when they're solving stuff for themselves, because when it comes to a game and competition, they're going to be asked to solve new novel problems all the time. And in my sport, in a lot of sports, the coach doesn't have a joystick and they can't control you. So it's important for the athlete to be able to, think for themselves and problem solve, and not just rely on that. So that's one. I think a lot of times coaches, we look at learning as very linear. So we'll break something down into its pieces and, put it back together after they've kind of like, had success, and everything looks neat and orderly. And I think from the stuff that I've read, the most transfer comes when it is, a whole skill and very representative of what they're going to see in competition. So I think, we want things to look orderly and want our players to have a lot of success, but I don't know if that's the best way to prepare them for the actual game.
Earlier, you talked about like the freedom for you that you kind of found. And again, I know some of that is rooted in some of the meditation and mindfulness practices and things like that. Um, but I think that word actually has some relevance to what you're also describing here in terms of how you're designing the training environment for those you lead to create some freedom for them to solve their own problems and to find solutions, be adaptable, and things like that. Is that something you could talk a little bit about in terms of like how you've seen this approach, this kind of ecological systems approach to coaching now influence the freedom through which an athlete competes with?
Yeah. So I think to give you an example, in the past, one thing in beach volleyball we see a lot of players struggle with is a deep serve that's kind of like at their neck, right? That's kind of hits their body in the midline. And I would get very prescriptive and want to, give them the answer and say, hey, you need to open up to your side and, set up an angle outside your body and like tilt all these little things, which, one of the quotes I like is that the body cares very little what the coach tells it. Like it's just reacting to the environment. And so, it's hard to remember all these things about what to do with your elbow. Um, but now it's more adding the freedom in is, we call it's the constraints led approach. So you give them a constraint like, hey, you need to start shallower. And so you're going to get a lot more interactions and it's just naturally happening to you deep. And, just give them the freedom to kind of solve that problem. And you don't just like leave them stranded. You still come in and like guide and say, hey, what if you tried this? Or like, what haven't you tried? And that kind of stuff, but giving them the freedom to kind of solve that problem. And maybe they come up with, different solutions than you wouldn't have thought that fits them or fits the situation. Because, I think a lot of times we map out skills in a very, you know, sterile environment. Like, this is the best way to move. But in reality, we don't know how unbalanced they were in that moment. We don't know what they were reading or late to pick up on. And so for it to come from them and them to have the freedom to like problem solve and make the ball go where they want it. Um, yeah, it's great. And I think it just the payoff of just as we watch our players and we see so much more creativity and just, finding ways to do stuff that isn't so scripted or the other team knows what's going to happen. So I think there's a lot of benefits.
Is something that maybe is tied to how you design, again, the training environment, those that physical practice and things. But kind of going back to you mentioning earlier some of the challenges that you confronted as a competitor in terms of like at times like the overthinking and maybe even like not being that you use the term like bulletproof, and just learning how to manage emotions and self-doubt and those types of things. So for you, when it comes to now with those that you lead, those that you serve, like when you start to see athletes maybe exhibit some of those signals that you felt like you experienced as a competitor, like what are some of the things that you found most helpful in coaching them? Yeah, what have you found most helpful in coaching those individuals?
Yeah. We had at the NCAA championships last year, one of our freshmen came up to me and she's like, I'm nervous. Indigo said I should come talk to you. um, and I went back to something I learned from CC Craft, who's been on our podcast a bunch. Um, it's that idea of like just own your 3 foot world, and like just the thing I used to go back to is like, what is the next task? How can you be really present and just do your best at that task and just take things one step at a time? So for her, it's like, okay, right now we're 40 minutes before we play. You don't need to worry about that first serve yet. Like, what right now in this 3 foot area in this present moment can you really do well? And if that's, stretching, be the best stretcher you can be. If that's putting on sunscreen, make sure you don't miss a spot. Like whatever it is, just do your best at that one task and not looking too far ahead. I think to me that's something I always go back to, and that's something I would encourage players is like not get too ahead of yourself. Worry about the championships. Just like what are you doing in this moment to get better? And for me, that's talking to you, and like I'm becoming a better coach in this moment and trying to learn from you, work on communication, whatever. This is what is the only thing that matters is this moment right now.
One of the things that has been fun to have some of these conversations with other guests is like hearing not only the things that they're learning. So like on one hand, I've had plenty of people that we've had conversations with. They're learning in the form of, reading, going to courses, talking to other coaches, podcasts, and so on. Some are working directly with a coach and getting coached and getting support and having a thought partner with them on the side. And then others also talk about the lessons that they've learned from the athletes themselves and how that has also shaped their coaching. So, you being in this parallel track of competing and coaching kind of in aligned at the same time, even like, what are some of the things that you've now taken from athletes that you've coached and that's either shaped how not only you coach differently, but also if it's something that has even shown up in how you compete?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the more you're around the players, you just see how different every individual is. And so I think as far as the coaching side, it's just embracing that like what you tell one player isn't just going to be this blanket answer for everybody. That you do have to approach everybody as an individual and connect with them and like find out, why they're doing what they're doing, what their motivation is. You really get to know them. And, through our podcast, that's been the one big thing almost everybody says is just the relationship side and the connection side and how important that is. Um, I think so. Just knowing that, carrying it over when I do, coach a player, it's just being open and curious. So it's not coming in with too many preconceived things of this is what's worked for me in the past, but like really, you know, observing what's working, observing what they're struggling with, having that dialogue to get to know them, and then try to get, the more you get to know them, the better coach you're going to be. Um, and then as far as how I transferred me as a player, I think there is technical stuff like this girl like moves really well doing this nice and low. I'll give that a try. This person really takes a risk on their serve and maybe like serves offline with some deception. I'll try to add that to my game. So I think some of that's going on too. But I think just embracing the fact that I have to be open and curious every single time I talk to a player and not have too many preconceived notions.
I just had a thought, and then now it disappeared. Um, I I didn't want to lose it, but anyway, well, don't worry, we'll edit that part out. I think with that, one of the things that again, I know I'm doing something that I shouldn't do, which is when I ask some of these questions, I'm kind of giving you a lot of freedom to either go with your playing and your coaching background, but I think there's so much richness in both that I want to open it up to whichever one you feel like is may resonate with the question. So I want to ask one more, at least in that regard. So one thing that I think is always interesting that is a challenge that we all face in coaching is the player that you're working with that is putting in the result or putting in the work and they're not reaping the results, that they're in that plateau or they feel like they're just not getting that breakthrough. And I would be curious kind of what that experience has been like for either you as a player and or now in those that you coach, and kind of what have been the main, have there been certain things that you feel like have created the best um, conditions for a breakthrough to occur?
Yeah, I think again, I like that analogy that learning is a maze, it's not a ladder. And so sometimes you're going to run into a wall and have to backtrack and, sidestep it. And I think it's just continual communication. And I think just on one hand, embracing frustration is part of the process. I think, players get frustrated when it doesn't go how they want and they are trying to implement a new part of their game and it doesn't just click right away. But like, there's going to be a point of frustration and struggle and challenge, and that's how we get better. Like, we can make drills really easy and lower the net and make you feel really confident and great about yourself, but there's not much learning going on. So I think just on one hand, embracing that process is challenging, and if you're challenged, that's a good thing. But then also not being stuck running into the wall either, and adapting, and maybe something isn't working, right? Like, I feel there's very few things that I'm like, this is the right answer. You're going to do it and get way better. Just follow this script. It's a lot of like, hey, come into the office. Let's watch some video. Like, what did you feel on this one? What could we do? Try differently. And it's really like I learn stuff from those video sessions. Like we leave with a plan that we're both aligned on. Like, hey, this is what we're going to commit to going forward. And it's not something like I knew ahead of time that this is what this athlete needs to do. Like I'll have an idea, but it is a collaboration. And I think the important thing is just committing to it. Let's say, if, we watch some video, we notice this is happening. Like, what do you want to try? Why do you think that'll work? Oh, like, are we aligned? And let's just commit to it and go after it. And, if we need to pivot and adapt, we will and try something different. But again, it's like that maze. You're just, trying different routes, and sometimes they don't work. But understanding that it's kind of like in my own career, I looked at it like in a given year, I'm going to have some good tournaments and some bad tournaments. I know I'm going to end a tournament being like, crap, why am I doing this? It's not worth it. This is too hard. And I'm going to end some other ones like, this is pretty awesome. But I think of it like a stock market, and it's pretty volatile in the short term. But as long as we're trending up, like we're moving in the right direction. So I think just kind of embracing that's the messy, ugly part of learning.
I think those are both the maze, the stock market. Those are both really beautiful, like kind of visual depictions of the process and stuff. And also like it gives you good perspective. Like that's what I love about what you just described with like the stock market. It's like, hey, when you zoom out now,
Mm.
that trend does not look how it feels when you're zoomed in on just the day to day or moment to moment and stuff. So I think that's a really beautiful description for it. And then I like the maze in a lot of ways too, because like when in particular when you start talking about like those wrong turns and like, okay, how fast can you learn? How fast can you adapt? And this is one that it's little timely, but I heard this. I ended up using this as a recent podcast episode where I talked a little bit about somebody was like, the GPS in your car can't guide you when you're parked. So if you've ever experienced that feeling of like you're leaving a parking garage or you're leaving a lot that you're unfamiliar with and you're trying to figure out, okay, the GPS is calibrating and you're not sure if you should go left, you're not sure if you should go right. In that moment, if you just stay put, it's not going to help you. Like it's just going to sit there as well. And so like it needs you to go. And the nice thing is the moment you start going, if you go the wrong way, it just simply reroutes you just like that. And I think of that as it relates to, being an athlete, but especially even as a coach, like those moments where, the easiest, like if it's just conceptual, like until you get out there and you start experimenting, until you start iterating and trying different things, like, yes, it may be wrong, or yes, it may not work as well as you like, but also it's get you quicker to a result that is and like the destination that you ultimately want to be. So I like the maze piece of it very much so. And I think with that, if we were to kind of use that as a metaphor for your coaching, could you maybe tell us a little bit about a moment where you felt like, ooh, it was a wrong turn, whether it was within a single interaction with somebody or whether it was in like even a season or a team that you felt like, hey, in hindsight, it ended up really changing how you coached and shifted because of it maybe not being the most ideal approach?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something specific. I'm sure there's a bunch of changes along the way. I know a couple years ago we were pretty into jump setting. It was like this new hot thing where throws off the blocker. It's something very common indoor, but on the beach you don't see it very much. And I think we were like really working on it and thinking this is the next level. This is going to make us separate us. And then our players just weren't committing to it in the games. So in practice it looked good, but it was really hard and risky to try in a game, and especially in the national championships is on the beach in Gulf Shores where it's very windy, and it's something that we probably spent a lot of time on that didn't really pay off. And so I think our goal is the same. It's still to disrupt the blocker and make life easier on the hitter, but there's other ways to do it. And so maybe even instead of taking the challenge of the setter making this athletic in the air jump set where they fake like they're gonna hit and then they set, maybe we can get it in a different way, and that's from the hitter just running a different route to try to get away from the blocker or something like stuff like that. That's one area that came to mind, is like maybe something strategy wise that we just adjusted because one, we didn't do it, and maybe there's a simpler way that can get the exact same benefits. But I like what you were saying about the GPS, because I feel like there's that Lincoln quote where it's like, if I had this long to cut down a tree, I would spend the first whatever 90% sharpening the axe. And I feel a lot of times I can just spend all day sharpening axes and not actually chopping. And so thinking about like even like the our podcast and your podcast, you can wait till you have all the right equipment and everything's perfect and the guest lists are all lined up. But you might never record an episode. And I think sometimes you got to jump in and then adjust as you go.
I think that's a really good example. That very much hits home. I can think of numerous things in my life where I've probably spent too much time um, sharpening the axe, and I think something else that I'll quickly share because I think it could tie in where I kind of want to go next, which is just I very much admire how much of a student you are and how like intellectually like curious and just the different things that you pull from. So I kind of want to explore your process for learning and development here in a moment. But before I get to that, so something that I think I shared this in one of the early episodes because I think it was kind of a mistake that I made kind of early on is I heard this distinction between there's very much a difference between being a librarian of the mind versus a warrior of the mind. And a librarian, it's like you're just constantly gathering, absorbing, consuming, you're reading, there's like, and we're in an era where like I mean, not that this probably applies to any era, but like especially now, like there's so much out there. Like you could spend this ungodly amount of time really diving in and trying to learn the intricacies and the details and stuff like that. But eventually, you have to get out onto the court and like actually implement these things and like do it and then iterate and figure out what works and what doesn't and stuff. Like it's a lot easier and it's a lot safer to just keep learning and then hold it all sitting on the sidelines, and never put it into action and stuff. So I do appreciate that sentiment of like I get the Lincoln thing. I think that one's a it's a great analogy from the standpoint of like also like you know I also my interpretation too is like getting clear on the problem, making sure you're clear on that and then, kind of before you jump in. But on the other side of it, it's like what you're describing is so spot on too that, you're also going to learn a lot by just getting in and starting to hack away at the tree and put things into action. So love all that. That being, oh, go ahead.
No, it made me think of one of the concepts that we like in motor learning is the idea that there's a difference between knowledge of and knowledge about. Knowledge about is like what you picture a coach writing on the whiteboard, and this is how everything works, blah blah blah, and this whole long lecture. But I feel like if you explain to me all the intricacies of how to hit a baseball and drew everything and to explain everything to me, and I read all these books, like I probably wouldn't be much better at hitting a baseball. And the knowledge of comes with that experience. And just, I think as coaches, sometimes we rely too much on the knowledge about something and explaining it, and just getting out there and experiencing it for yourself is how we learn.
There's there's a quote that I've heard. It's in a research paper that was peer reviewed several years ago, and I'm going to definitely butcher this, but the question that it offered a distinction around is like, are you producing knowledgeable trainees or like skilled and adaptable performers? And I think that's kind of what you're describing. And like I remember somebody who's done a lot of work with anyway, she's done a lot of amazing work in our profession. Like one of the things that she always talked about that it really stood out. Her name's Colleen Hacker. She talked about sport is not a multiple choice test. In other words, like just because you have knowledge, about or whatever, like it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate. It's going to transfer. Like you have to be able to apply it under pressure, and that's really where skill starts to emerge and things like that. So anyway, all that to say, I know we could probably spend the whole episode or a part two just unpacking all of these concepts and principles and things within ecological systems and go further. But I do want to spend a little bit more time hearing kind of your process for learning and growth. And because I think that that's something that, again, all of my conversations, like you can learn a lot from somebody in terms of how much of not only a learner they are, but how like, yeah, how eager they are to grow by the questions they ask. Like you ask very high level questions, which I really admire, at least in all of our previous interactions and things. So that being said, how, like, could you walk us through just kind of your approach to learning and growing as a coach, and not just from like that the physical and technical piece of it, but also those other components that emerge in coaching too.
Yeah. I think one thing this podcast, doing it for 10 years, has taught me is just how important it is to be, like I said, curious and a learner. And for me, it's like a superpower that I feel as a coach, you have this burden to be an authority and an expert on stuff. Um, and you want to have all the right answers. Otherwise, you're a fraud. And my mindset is just be learning. And like, it just gives me so much freedom to, go into a meeting with my notebook in hand. And all I'm thinking about is like, how can I learn from this? How can this, I get something out of this? Even if it's like I'm speaking to the team, like just be upfront about it. Like you don't have to know everything. You're just like, I want to get better. This is what I know, and just be very open. I'm reading a book right now called "What's Our Problem" by Tim Urban. It's a little bit about political divide and echo chambers and stuff, but just that idea that like I'm not protecting like this, like my side. This side is just open to criticism and the evidence, and thinking like a scientist, and being okay pivoting and changing your mind. You're not protecting something. So I think to me that's just been a superpower, that like I don't have to be right. I just have to be open to hear your side, my side, and then hopefully through that discussion, I'll change my mind and I'll learn. So for me, that just that's where it starts, is just the willingness to always be learning in every situation. And then, from there, I think just as far as questions and stuff, just make it tangible is what it always comes back to for me. I think a lot of times we talk in theory and abstraction. To give you an example, like even talking to a player, if somebody gives you feedback and says, "Oh, like you look nervous there," there's not much to do with that. But if you make it tangible and say, "Looks like you're not communicating with your partner. You're, being quiet. You're moving. I don't know, whatever it is. You actually have something actionable you can change and do." And so I think the same thing with podcast hosts is we talk in kind of broad terms, but like again, the coach listening wants to know, what am I going to do different in my practice tomorrow, and how can I decipher all these things you're talking about, and how can I apply it on my side. So then be curious, be open, and then just always filtering it through this, like, how can I use this? Just if I'm reading a book, writing in the margins, like, how will this inform my practice tomorrow? I think that's just a really good exercise.
I think that's a really great exercise. I am drawing a blank on what domain or industry I heard this from. Um, but what I heard somebody say once, they called it the Tuesday principle, which was basically this notion that if you're consuming and you're learning something, like you need to be able to answer, like, okay, how can I implement it this Tuesday? Like, whatever day of the week that is. And it's no different from what you were describing there. Like, okay, how do I put this into action tomorrow? It's like if you're creating something or you're sharing something, like if it's not something that those that you're trying to reach, whether it's a coach or a player, whatever, whoever that population is, like if they can't put it into action that following Tuesday, then it's probably worth revisiting and finding something more tangible, more specific. The other thing I liked about what you described, even with just your specific example with the player, is this notion of like not only the specificity of the feedback, but also the like there's feedback and then there's feed forward, the cliche, right? Of like, okay, now like moving forward, how do you implement this, or what would it look like different for you to put this into action or to make this change and things like that. And so I think though, anytime you can start to have those as frameworks to consider as a coach or whoever, I think that's really useful. The thing that I want to kind of zoom in just a touch on the podcast here, because I'd love to actually just know even like the origin behind it, and just kind of where that started in the first place, and then I have a few follow-ups, but let's start with just kind of that origin and inspiration behind it.
Yeah, so it was a little over 10 years ago. John Mayer is a good friend of mine, and we liked listening to podcasts. And I think it's something that I've always done, is I'm very inspired by what's around me. So, I hear a good song, I'm like, I should write music. And sometimes sometimes it hurts me because you derail and want to jump around a lot. But we were listening to podcasts and we're like, we should do this. It sounds good. I think we were deciding between, it wasn't like always like, hey, we should do coaching. It was like, hey, we like this, we like that. But we ended up like, hey, we both coached, we're both passionate about that. And so we kind of started with an iPhone sitting on a stool between us, with some very bad audio in his garage. And we had gone to a conference called Train the Gap. It was at LMU where John coaches, where Trevor Reagan, him from, he does the Learner Lab. Back then it was Train Ugly. He had a bunch of people come in and talk about the gap between maybe what the research is telling us about learning and stuff and what we actually do. And basically our first 5 podcasts was just like our own debrief from that, like the stuff that we learned talking about coaching. And so as far as like the whole thing, we did not have a microphone. We weren't prepared, but we just did it anyway. We course corrected and navigated. If we had a GPS, it would be saying, you're in the lake. Um, but we got a lot out of it. We enjoyed it. And we eventually like branched out and started asking guests. And That's why it's so cool what you do, or you do both. Like, if I was just going to talk into a microphone for 20 minutes, I'd be very intimidated and worried that I wasn't giving any value. Um, but we cold called some people, and we've been very amazed by how open the volleyball community, but just the coaching community in general, is about saying yes for no money, coming in, giving their time, and talking, and just trying to push the game forward. And I remember we had one of our early ones is we reached out to James Kerr, who wrote Legacy about the All Blacks. And this is, we were still like, maybe we just found out what, it wasn't even Zoom, it was Skype or something. And we reached out, and he was like an international call, and we were so nervous, prepared, like planned every question. So we were like robots reading it. But that's kind of how it started. And we just continued. It's been a great way for John and I to connect. Having a co-host is pretty nice because it kind of keeps you guys accountable, where you have to do everything yourself. But I have John saying, "Hey, I found this guest," or like, "What are we gonna do next month?" And then just it's been the biggest self just development for me and my coaching is just the stuff I've learned from the podcast, being exposed to new ideas, and just the amount of expert guests we've had on, and just it's like my own little journal that I get to have. So that's kind of where it started.
I think that's a perfect direction I want to kind of build off of a little bit here. So, what I'd love to hear more about is just what have been maybe some of those specific ways that um, those conversations and reflections for you have shaped your coaching philosophy and or clarified, I guess, your own thinking as a coach.
Yeah, a lot of times, like I remember we had a guest on named Lauren Anderson who brought some of those ecological ideas to our mind. They're the first one to kind of bring it to us, and we're just like, "What is he talking about? Like, this is so overcomplicated. It's just coaching." And so you get some of that, like you get a new idea, and then the next step is just to dig into it and learn more about it, and just to not let something, not to be dismissive, is kind of, I think, the big thing. One, it comes from doing research for a guest. So, like, if a guest is coming on to talk about their book, read their book and learn more about it, so you can just be a better host. But just to not be dismissive, and if somebody comes in and says something counter to what we, our own framework or what we think, is to really investigate it and see why they're saying that, where they're coming from, and could there be something of value here that I could use next Tuesday. So just openness, and then just investigate it.
Now that you've interviewed so many high quality coaches over the years with it, are there any patterns that you're seeing or noticing amongst like those that have found a way to produce maybe more sustainable success or excellence? Yeah, any patterns in terms of how they coach, how they lead, how they think, etc.
Yeah, I think the big one is just that, like I mentioned, the relationship side. Everybody talks about how important connection is and just caring for the athletes. It's not the best coaches and leaders we've been around. It's just not a transactional thing where you come in, do this for me, you get a scholarship, whatever it is. It's, they want to be part of their lives and transform them into be better humans. And I think the athletes can sense that, and they want to be around a program where they feel value, and I think and the coach cares about them. And I think the culture is another big piece in creating a safe learning environment. And I think where the players want to be, especially today, where it's a little easier to transfer in the college realm, is to be a coach that can connect and to foster really good relationships, not just between yourself and the athletes, but the athletes amongst themselves. And then just like I'm always impressed with just how coaches that are adaptable and that they change. Our AD was giving us this story about Coach K and talking about his culture, and he's like, "Oh man, your culture is just always so strong." But he was like, "We've changed a lot. We never shoot 3-pointers. We just pass, get inside, and then we started losing, and so our culture changed. And then it became, if you come here, it's you're here for 4 years. There's no one and done. And then we started losing, and so we kind of changed and embraced that. I think the best coaches can find a way to still live out their values and their non-negotiables, but also adjust and adapt to, what that team needs in this given year.
Hmm. We've talked about adaptability already in the conversation with players, but obviously I think we're quickly discovering like how important that is for coaches, and I think especially in just how you just talk to so many coaches nowadays, and it seems like the landscape is so volatile. It's so uncertain. There's a lot of moving parts and things like that. I think talk about a really important skill, but also what is a foundation of it. So this just came to me, but this is how my brain works, is very much in like metaphors and stories and things like that. But I don't know if you've heard, like there's this analogy around like skyscrapers and how they're built. Have you heard this at all?
No, tell me more.
Okay, so the Cliff Notes version, I'm gonna probably butcher something, but like skyscrapers are purposefully designed to have very solid, strong foundations, but at the top they sway in the wind. Now, I didn't know that for a long time, and I'm glad I didn't know that for a long time. I would have been very nervous in a number of buildings I've walked into over the years, but they're built to sway. So in essence, like it's important to have a strong foundation and also be flexible, and so it's flexible in methods, flexible in your approach and strategy, all that. But what I heard that I really like is the connection piece is the foundation. Like that's not going to ever go anywhere. And I think in the world that we're in now, I think there's a number of people that would say that that's maybe as important as ever. And yet it's also been something that through the inception of human beings on this planet, connection and belonging has always been, I guess, a foundation. So I think it's cool to kind of see you describe that that is a pattern that has emerged amongst these really successful coaches that you've had, and now how that's also shaping your approach as well.
Yeah, what have you found with all the elite coaches and organizations you've been around? Are there any common threads for good leaders?
I think it goes hand in hand. I do think the curiosity and adaptability piece go in like that. There is that openness of having kind of core standards, but also then flexible in like the methods. But I think that's a big one. I think I sound like a broken record, I think, when I say this, but I think I just see it show up time and time again. And I first heard this from I interviewed Chris Peterson. He's a former Division I college football head coach, and he on a in a different platform he talked about that there's the three biggest mistakes that leaders make can generally fit into one of three buckets. It's a failure to define expectations and standards, the failure to manage expectations and standards, and it's a failure to model expectations and standards. That has really resonated. And one thing that I've noticed in my conversations with previous guests is like the modeling one, like that one comes up in almost every interview. Like I can't be asking players to do something that I'm not willing to do myself, and I think we talk about integrity and alignment between actions and words. Like the other way we frame it is like, does your audio match your video? Like, is what I see you do align with what you're saying and describing and stuff? So I think the modeling piece of it is one that I would say it seems like it's showing up more and more in high quality coaches, but I also think, and this is also me reflecting on my own failures as a leader, is like I could easily go back and probably put them into one of those three buckets. Times where I haven't provided the necessary clarity for somebody in a role or a task. I haven't clearly defined those expectations or standards on the front end, which then we sometimes people like to ask like, oh, like what's your approach to having a difficult conversation or a hard conversation? There can still be challenging conversations down the road, but a lot of that gets mitigated if you're clear on the front end, and if you're clear with the expectations and standards. So I think that can help mitigate some. And then again, the managing piece is it's like We can't just say this in, in baseball historically, pro baseball, it's like, you exit spring training and into March, like you can't say one thing in March and then when somebody goes or drifts off course in June or July, all of a sudden be like, change your mind and not address it and not talk about it. So I do appreciate the more and more people that I've spoken to, I do feel like I hear those themes emerge a lot amongst these kind of higher quality coaches.
I like that structure. And I like the on the modeling side. I think sometimes in coaches we first think of it, we're thinking like, oh, like show up on time, be disciplined, be prepared, that kind of stuff. Another thing is a lot of times we ask our players to make mistakes and stretch themselves and be uncomfortable. And I think, how uncomfortable and how much are we stretching ourselves as coaches? That's hard sometimes.
Um, that reminds me, so one of the I've referenced him on a recent episode where I talk about I use it as like I think one of the more underrated mental skills or tools is the word and this actually ties very closely to what you talked about on the front end that you can feel a certain way or have self-doubt or be afraid or something like that, and that doesn't mean that you have to act on it, and it means that you can choose. So you're not invalidating what you feel,
Yeah.
and yet you're also acknowledging that you have a choice in where you go next or how you think and so on. So anyway, I attribute this also to his name is Travis Thomas, who is a culture performance coach. And we brought him out to a leadership summit this past year. And it was awesome because he and I were on this prep call for, kind of going over. I was describing like, okay, this is going to be the group. Like, we're going to have all of our player development coaches there and like some other coaches in the building. And I knew his background kind of comes from improv. And so I knew he was going to want to do some improv in it. And I was super excited about it. But I was like, we also got to make sure that we don't just say we have an improv coach coming in here because people are going to be like, "Hey, I'm sick. I can't make it." Like we knew that some of our coaches were going to be a little more hesitant. But the thing that we ended up discussing and agreeing that I really stood out for me is he's like, when you stop being a player and you get further and further removed from it, sometimes the less and less you experience like the discomfort that players encounter on a regular basis, like not just performing in a big moment but like learning a new skill, maybe all of a sudden having to completely adapt and change your approach to something and be kind of um, evolve as a performer. And so as a coach, the further and further you get away from that, like, okay, well, when are moments that you create space for you to get uncomfortable, to step outside your comfort zone, to make mistakes and stuff. And so it was awesome because when he came in, that was how he talked about defining expectations and standard. That was actually kind of how he set the tone for the session. And it was awesome because it was just a really nice way to illustrate that this is something that you ask players to do every single day. And yet, when is the last time you deliberately stepped into a space of discomfort to grow?
Yeah, it is so hard to it's easy to forget how hard the game is and how hard what our players are doing. And if coaching was just if they could just do exactly what we said, coaching would be so easy. And but like that's why it's fun is that challenge. I like the improv stuff. I want to talk to you more about it at some point because we've been thinking with our own mindfulness stuff. Is a lot of it comes from this like me in my own head, and we play a partner sport, so we've been experimenting a lot more with kind of partner mindfulness stuff with a lot of improv where you're with your partner and you guys are like singing the same song lyrics, like like one person singing, you're trying to match them, or doing like a tai chi thing where you just have to mimic their emotions to kind of just be present and like responding and aware. And I think it's kind of cool because I think a lot of times I think of the mental stuff, it's like sitting by myself with my eyes closed, but we're play a partner sport and you're out in the real world and just being a little more present and like how can I serve my partner or be a better listener. I think there's a lot to that.
I think there's something to be said about in improv, how it again, talk about, we used that distinction earlier of like being on the sidelines versus on the court. Like it forces you to get on the court and into action mode. So again, and I'll attribute this to Travis because this is one of the things that he shared, and I'm gonna make sure I definitely connect you to because I think he'll. I'm happy to talk about it too because I think it's really fun, and he's way better and an expert in it. One of the things that we've talked about is like even like something as simple as like word association, right? Like if you and I are kind of going back and forth trying to, we throw out a word and then, okay, what comes to mind for you? And then boom, like first thing, and like try to reduce that like thinking period between. What's awesome is like, that just gets you into action mode. Like you're not thinking about the last word. Like, and what gets you in trouble is when you start trying to predict, like, okay, well, what am I
Hmm.
going to say next? You have to be completely free and present with the person that you're interacting with. And I just thought that was such a cool. It really wasn't until conversations with him where I started to think about like improv is actually a really wonderful practice, like mindfulness practice in an active form. And so I think there's very much something to be said there.
Oh, and there's so much translation to sport where if you're premeditating something, you might be too far behind because the context is always changing.
Absolutely. Well, I've got two questions. I don't know how you are on time. Is that okay?
Do it.
Okay, all right, because I want to be mindful of your time. But two things I think I'd be remiss also to kind of touch on is one of which is being like, so you and your wife are both Janelle are both AVP pros, if I can speak. And between her competitive career, your son catch, the podcast, the writing, like coaching, all these different hats that you wear. I think I'd be really interested to hear you talk about just kind of how you found success in staying connected to the things that you really love the most, and like how you also um, avoid burnout too, because you're doing a lot of different things, but that obviously is something that so many coaches nowadays are encountering. And so for you, with everything that you have, what have you found be helpful for you?
I feel like I guess two things come to mind is one, like if I get a Sunday off, let's say I'm lucky enough to get a Sunday off, like what I want to do is not just like watch TV and sit around. It's to write or it's to do my passions. And so although maybe it doesn't feel like I'm resting as much, I feel very fulfilled for doing it. And so for me, like if I feel like I'm even working out, I'm 44. I competed last weekend in a tournament, so I'm still competing, but the window is shrinking. But like I just feel better if I do get a good workout in. And again, it's less rest as much as just like I feel alive after those kinds of activities. So I guess I don't have like an easy answer other than jumping back and forth for me between different disciplines is a break. And if you're in the heart, I think of it like a globe and you can kind of spin it. And maybe there's a different thing in the forefront in that moment. Um, but like in season, volleyball coaching is taking up most of my time. But if I, spin it a little bit and get times to write, like I feel like just whole, like more balanced. And then on the busyness and the productivity, like day to day, I don't feel that busy, but stuff just adds up. Like I feel like even, like I said, writing a little bit in the morning is not that much of a commitment compare if I'm not looking at Instagram or something and just do writing instead, um you know over a long enough period of time that adds up to a book. And I think that's like for me, like growth like that is just really addicting. And I've never been somebody that loves being in the gym and working out, but if you see those numbers go up on the weights, it's like to me that's like what keeps me motivated. And same thing with writing or podcasting, like to be able to look back or see like the numbers add up, it's pretty fulfilling. And then as
Uh,
far as like the family side, my wife's very patient, and so she does give me a lot of free time. But then when you do have to get time together with your my wife and son is like just how can I be fully present and spin that globe so that family time is the one thing that's front and center.
I love the visual of it. I also love that you started to use the word like whole. Like that's the thing that like those are all these different pieces of what makes you you and whole and complete and again not that those always are going to get equal amount of time, but just making sure that you're taking the time to spin the globe so you're giving at least the attention that each one needs and deserves at any given time. So I love that. This leads me, final question, Billy, and I know you've listened to the show a little bit. I'm sorry for that. So maybe you're a little already familiar with the question that I like to end with, but I do want to ask you, what's something that you're proud of that maybe you don't always get an excuse to talk about?
Yeah, the because we talked about my writing, so I'm gonna take that off. I think I talk a lot about the success I've had as a player, and I've been competing professionally for 21 years now, so it's a long time, and there's a lot of ups and downs. But like looking back, I think what I'm really proud of is in college, I was like the backup guy, and I got some playing time, but I was a utility guy that got plugged in here and there. And every year I knew like next year is my year. and I put in like played way more than, my competitors, and I, did track workouts. I did everything I could. And I think and it never really happened. I was always like, the backup guy. And I think that discipline and resilience, like looking back, has been for sure what has set me up for success as a professional. Um, I think there's so many good players that better players than me that came in my generation that stopped because it was really hard and you lose a lot. And I was just used to losing and still going to work the next day. And maybe things would have been a little different if the transfer portal was there and it was that easy. But I really look back and am just so proud that of the way I competed and still gave it my all, even when I didn't reap those rewards. And I think that resilience has just made the rest of my career, playing and other stuff, just um, so much easier because I look at that as an example of like, oh, I can grind, I can get through this, I can lose and still show up and work the next day. So that's something I'm very proud of. That I'm still like, if you had told little Billy that he would still be playing volleyball and writing stuff at this age, I think it'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really appreciate you sharing that example, but also I think that's a really kind of nice full circle moment where at the beginning of the conversation we talked a little bit about obviously the writing and the books and stuff, but also just how those have been a medium through which you could also talk about some of the things that you experienced as an athlete and some of the thoughts and the mindset behind it. So it's kind of cool to hear how that's also now been shaped through not just some successes, but also some challenges and adversity along the way. So I will just echo what I've shared at the beginning that I'm really appreciative of you not only taking the time to have this conversation with me and bear with me during all of these questions, but also I've just really enjoyed the conversations that I've had a chance to have with you over the last several months and just getting to get a little bit of a preview behind like kind of how your mind works and stuff. So now it's kind of cool. Like I'm like, okay, I can kind of fill in some gaps and these pieces start to make a little bit more sense. But yeah, I'm just super appreciative of you and taking some time and yeah, I know that there was a lot of really good stuff that a lot of coaches in a lot of different sports could benefit from. So thank you.
Exact. And I think you said you liked analogies and stories, and I think that's what makes you such a good speaker and a podcast host. Those are things that I take away. I feel like we have these discussions, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna remember that skyscraper thing, or I'm gonna remember, this, the GPS. I think those things are very sticky, and I think they're, what resonate with athletes and coaches.
Appreciate it. I'll just very quickly, last thing, this is like getting it in at the shot clock, is I actually heard somebody say, so there's if you're familiar with like Ryan Holiday, obviously he's written all the books that others are very familiar with, I'm sure, but he has a research assistant by the name of Billy Oppenheimer, and he has a really great newsletter that he puts out every Sunday. But I was listening to him on a podcast, and he actually shared something that I was like, oh, like this resonates a lot. And I got excited because he said that we live in a kind of this world now that, like, we talk about dopamine hits and stuff, and how a lot of people are getting like dopamine hits through, going viral and, trying to find the next big podcast, and how that's going to now be received by the world and so on. He's like, my dopamine hits come when I find a story, or when I find an insight, or when I find a new perspective that I can share. And I was like, ooh, like I really, I feel the same way. Like I geek out over these. So I appreciate you being somebody to bear with me as I process those, not only on your podcast, but also in the days in between or during the week where I kind of view it as my audio journal. So I appreciate the support, and again, I'm excited for to continue to learn from you moving forward. So
Exactly.
Thanks for tuning in to today's conversation with Billy Allen. I hope something in this episode resonates and it maybe gives you a new lens, a new question, or a new framework you can bring back to the people that you lead. And if this episode brought value to you, I'd encourage you to please share it with someone that you think might benefit from it, whether that's a colleague, a friend, another coach, or just anybody, any leader out there that you think might benefit. And if you haven't already, a rating or review of the Threshold Lab on whatever platform you enjoy listening on would go a long way to help others find these shows. You can also hit subscribe so you never miss any upcoming episodes. And as always, if something stood out to you or it sparked a question, anything that you want to kind of continue to chat more a little bit about, feel free to reach out. Again, I've opened up my calendar for December with a lot of different coaching calls. So if anybody wants to just connect or converse in general, I'd love to hear from you and explore things a little bit more. So thanks again for listening today, and I'll see you into the next episode.